First of all, good morning. Hope the speakers are all here, but okay. As I am sure you have all realized by now, we organized the program so that all of us together can hear at least one major talk, a plenary, reflecting on the issues expected to be discussed in each of the topic-oriented panels. We did this because of a firm commitment to the purpose of the conference as an opportunity for the exchange of perspectives across geographical, religious, ideological, and disciplinary boundaries. We see both the study of anti-Semitism and the attempt to eradicate it as requiring a wide coalition. So where better to start than by making sure that some of the important material presented at our conference is shared among the various fields. One has only to take a look at the subjects in this session to see this perspective in action. Our session today will stretch from philosophy, ethics, psychology and education, to the social sciences and to Israel studies. We will see that every one of these fields contributes to our discussion, and that clearly the attempt to deal with modern anti-Semitism cannot proceed without attention to all of these areas. We're happy to have here experts in all these fields, and we'll now proceed to their presentations. Our first presentation will be by Julius Schoeps. Julius H. Schoeps is a political scientist and historian. He studied history, intellectual history, politics, and theater in Erlangen and Berlin, graduated in 1969 with a doctorate and habilitated in 1973. From 1974 to 91, he served as professor of political science and was the founding director of the Solomon Ludwig Steinheim Institute for German Jewish History at the University of Duisburg. From 1991 to 2006, he was professor of modern history with a focus on German Jewish history at the University of Potsdam. Since 1992, he's director of the Mendelssohn Center for European Jewish Studies at the University of Potsdam and has been a visiting professor in New York, Oxford, Seattle, Tel Aviv, and Budapest. He will speak on philosophical hypocrisy and ethical correctness in public discourses on Israel.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As you may have already gathered, I'm not Julius Schoeps. He asked me to convey his apologies for being unable to be here today and also to read out his paper to you in his stead. Ladies and gentlemen, currently the Western world and Israel are ensuring mutually beneficial relations and benefiting from economic cooperation. However, they increasingly differ in attitudes toward war, the nation-state, nationalism, and religion. Nevertheless, public interest in Israel remains very strong. Israel continues to be a curiously frequent topic in the European and American news, for example, with different views on that little state made by Jews, but situated amongst several Arab countries totally unsettled by the failed Arab Spring and the subsequent disasters. The imbalance in reporting, I assume, is obvious. Israeli airstrikes on army convoys in southern Syria carrying weapons for the Lebanese Hezbollah get more attention in the German media than, for example, Assad's ceaseless air raids against the civilian population in bleeding cities like Idlib. And inside Israel? Interestingly, the Israeli installation of electronic warning devices at the entrances to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem causes more stir in the German public than the permanent digging of terrorist underground tunnels right from the Gaza Strip. Interesting, is it not? However, it is not my part today to speak about the impacts of German or other Western media coverage of Israel on public discussions and controversies. I will rather focus on intellectual voices in the Western world who have distinguished themselves as fundamental critics of current Israeli politics and society, who receive a lot of public attention also in the international arena, but who are themselves Jewish. I'm not arguing that these intellectuals I will refer to are prototypical for the Western intellectual scene in general, or even for the Jewish intellectual scene. However, I think all these examples reveal, at least on second glance, a kind of philosophical hypocrisy that overlooks the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, invites misunderstandings, and provokes applause from both the far right and the left. If there's enough time, I also want to show that there are similar trends and phenomena among civic organizations who consider radical enmity against Israel as part of their ethical correctness. And I mean here, in particular, several Christian churches and congregations. I think we can spare ourselves long-winded explanations as to why philosophers, or in a broader sense, intellectuals, are actively participating in actions of delegitimizing of the state of Israel. The question why seems wearisome, but it is a fact that some of the worldwide leading intellectuals are obsessed now to describe Israel as one of the biggest problems of humankind in the present age. And that appears to me to be quite a serious issue. As I mentioned, Jewish intellectuals are noticeably involved, and I will start with the case of Omri Böhm. Böhm, a very young Jewish philosopher born in Israel, lived in Germany for a while, but is now teaching at New York. He published a long essay in the New York Times of March 9, 2015, titled "The German Silence on Israel and Its Cost." In this essay, he sharply criticized renowned German intellectuals like Jürgen Habermas for, as he put it, the reluctance to speak critically about Israel. Admittedly, Böhm wrote that he could understand a general hesitation among German intellectuals in commenting and assessing Israeli politics because of German responsibility for the crimes of the Holocaust. However, in the same essay in the New York Times, Omri Böhm went so far as to conclude, quote, "When intellectuals like Jürgen Habermas and Günter Grass fail to speak out, they are stepping into a familiar and dangerous trap," end quote. Notwithstanding that Günter Grass, in fact, already took an extremely critical position against Israel in his disputed poem What Must Be Said, Was gesagt werden muss, in 2012, a lot of question marks remain regarding Omri Böhm's accusation against Habermas and colleagues. First of all, who defines when a philosopher has to intervene in everyday politics? What is the suggested guideline for political intervention? And which countries and politics, which conflicts and human rights abuses have to be on top of the agenda? Böhm is describing the German intellectual silence regarding present Israeli politics as dangerous. But what about when the voices keep silent regarding Russia's crimes in Crimea, China's human rights violations in Tibet, American Guantanamo, and Assad's gas attacks against his own Syrian population? But Omri Böhm goes further in his criticism. Something really seems to plague him. And in an interview with the Deutschlandfunk, a well-established public German radio station, he stated that, quote, "Zionism wasn't compatible with humanistic values," end quote. In this interview, of course, Böhm is responding to a possible cementation of the Jewish character of the State of Israel, pushing the famous question, either or, entweder oder. Either a Jewish state or, as the other option, a democratic, liberal, etc. state, but without a Jewish imprint. However, in fact, Omri Böhm indicates that Zionism is, at least in his mind, not compatible with humanistic values, and that appears, I would say, to be a bit much. Should this mean, conversely, that the Zionist movement was a distinct inhuman imprint? And would he be unacceptable to modern and enlightened Covils? Probably I'm not the right person to assess the real impacts of Omri Böhm's critique of Habermas and his colleagues, and also not the social impacts when alleging incompatibility of Zionism and humanistic values. Böhm, however, says he loves his home country, Israel, but explains that he is very worried about its future. On the other hand, we can assume that the moral radicalism in his statements invites misinterpretation and the denigration of the whole Jewish national project. Once more, the current Jewish state of Israel is considered the biggest obstacle for a possible peace between Israelis, or better, Israeli Jews and Palestinians. From there, it is only a small step to the overemphasis of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as one of the biggest trouble spots in the Middle East, and to see it as the crucial problem of the whole region. However, at least since the failed Arab Spring and the extremely violent, fanatic and ideologically heated civil wars following the fall of autocratic regimes in the Middle East, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, we know that the whole region is shaken by much worse problems than this conflict. Though also among leading intellectuals like, for example, Noam Chomsky, the perception predominates that the former colonial empires, and nowadays more or less exclusively the United States, are mainly responsible even for the actual outbreak of civil wars and excessive massacres among civic populations. We find such provocative theses among European intellectuals, but currently most prominently in the United States. Noam Chomsky is probably the most idealized thinker who mixes an allegedly disastrous American Middle East policy together with special American-Israeli interests, and so conspiracy theorists may find a lot of fodder for their absurd stories. It might be debatable to what extent such an overemphasis of Israel's allegedly destructive impact on the whole Middle East, strongly supported by the US, is just a naive byproduct of intellectual analysis, of ideological obsession, or, indeed, of philosophical hypocrisy. We have this phenomenon, aside from Omri Boehm, as one of the youngest, also among other icons of the left in America, and again among Jews. Judith Butler might be seen as a specific example of this strange intermixture of ideological premises, moral radicalism, starry-eyed and yes, maybe even dangerous admiration of different cultures, and, on the other hand, the rigorous damnation of Israel. Obviously, for Butler, as a Berkeley philosopher of postmodern structuralism, well esteemed around the globe, it is very important to understand Hamas and Hezbollah as social movements, as progressive and left, as part of the global left. So it is no wonder that Judith Butler is also a supporter of the international boycott, divestment and sanctions movement against Israel, the BDS. Interestingly, Butler is also very popular in Germany, and in September 2012 she was awarded with the prestigious Theodor Adorno Prize in Frankfurt am Main. This provoked, of course, protest by Jewish organizations, but it didn't help. Let me just mention one other single strange episode in the case of Judith Butler, which indicates the whole dilemma of those intellectuals strangely fixed on Israel's current policy. Judith Butler is in favor of a binational state of Jews and Palestinians with an Arab majority, which would mean, of course, the end of the Jewish state. However, especially wondrous is Butler's justification for such a proposal. In her book, Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism, she seriously argues that, quote, the loss of the Jewish demographic superiority in Israel would guarantee the perspectives of democracy in the whole region. When she wrote the book, the Arab Spring had already failed. Again, we might speculate whether Judith Butler's views on the history, nature, and future perspective of the State of Israel are ideologically blurred or ethically overcoded, or just the result of ivory tower exercises far away from the real developments in the Middle East. The same question makes a lot of sense when we come to Noam Chomsky. There is no doubt that Chomsky is one of the most respected intellectuals on the left worldwide, and in some cases on the far left. And Noam Chomsky is renowned for his harsh criticism on both American and Israeli politics for about 50 years. He is brilliant in certain analysis of power politics and fatal political dependencies. People from very different backgrounds, ages and cultures flock to his lectures and disputations. Regardless of this, there are some Chomsky quotes and statements which presumably lack any reasonable content. Thus, since 2008, Chomsky has supported the Free Gaza movement, calling it a brave and necessary enterprise. And in 2013, Chomsky was one of the academics who called on Stephen Hawking to boycott the prestigious International Facing Tomorrow conference in Jerusalem, successfully, as we know. Later on, in an interview with Amy Goodman for Democracy Now!, Chomsky said, Israel's action in Palestine are much worse than apartheid in South Africa. Let's pause for a moment and remember the bloodshed in Soweto in 1976, just one of the white crimes of violence with about 500 casualties among children and teenagers. Remember the townships covered by fences behind which people of all ages died of thirst or starvation. At the same time, we find statements by Noam Chomsky who reveal a dangerous underestimation, or shall I say minimization, of objective threats. For example, when he compares Israel and Iran in their respective striving for regional power. In March 2015, Chomsky said in a TV debate with Ezra Levant, Israel has invaded Lebanon 5 times, Iran hasn't invaded anyone. Also in spring 2015, Chomsky gave an interview with Euronews, and despite Barack Obama's strong efforts at that time to reach a nuclear deal with Iran, Chomsky said, there are 2 states who cause disaster in the Middle East by permanently carrying out aggressions, violence, terroristic and illegal acts. Both are atomic states with giant arsenals of nuclear weapons. Chomsky was referring to the United States and Israel as nuclear states strongly feared by the rest of the world, and in the converse argument he showed, again, a lot of empathy for Iran and understanding for its effort to also reach the status of an atomic power. Chomsky indeed claimed in the same Euronews interview, quote, Iran has very small military spending, even in terms of the region, not to mention those of the United States. The strategic doctrine of Iran is defensive, just conceptualized in a way that an attack can be repelled until diplomacy will intervene successfully. But the United States of America and Israel, those both rogue states, don't want to tolerate this kind of deterrent. And further on, no strategic analyst with a minimum of brain would think that Iran would ever apply a nuclear weapon. There is no indication that the ruling clerics, whatever we think about them, would be interested to destroy everything they possess. End quote. It is well known that Noam Chomsky's long-standing professor at the MIT, brilliant linguist and author of about 100 books, had already been proffering extreme positions many years before, just to mention his sympathy for the Cambodian mass murderer Pol Pot and his demonstrated respect for the French Holocaust denier Robert Faurisson. These were surprises in former times, but in case of the Iran it includes, especially now, a kind of risky dimension when one of the biggest intellectual icons of the global left, and not to forget a Jew, starts to whitewash the Iranian Islamic regime in its criminal efforts. One may find several explanations for such a loss of reality, and even presuming that the argument of unconditional self-defense might contribute to the ambitious Iranian atomic program, what about the Iranian export of terrorism around the globe? Dr. Stefan Griegert, who was visiting professor at our Moses Mendelssohn Center in Potsdam 1 year ago, and who is also among us at this fascinating conference, could describe Iranian terroristic activities as we face them today in real detail. In fact, it seems to be a great illusion that the Islamic regime in Iran is only a threat for the Middle East region. Its secret operations have meanwhile been traced in myriad countries, including today's Germany and, please do not forget, those tens of thousands of Iranian soldiers and officers now fighting for Assad in Syria in line with Russian troops. Probably we cannot imagine a scenario when those Iranian troops positioned in Syria would get permission to move forward to the Israeli borderline. But back to Noam Chomsky and his demonizing view on American and Israeli politics on the one hand, and the apology for current Iranian politics on the other hand. Where are the plausible reasons for this we can identify? Is it, so we might ask, the ideological factor in his mind that puts the world upside down? Or is it, first of all, a compulsive desire to make the Western world guilty for all the evils of today? However, considering the statements mentioned, I guess it becomes hard to negate a certain touch of intellectual hypocrisy. The impression would be wrong that notorious anti-Israeli critiques among leading intellectuals would just be an exclusively American or even American Jewish problem. Although there are many more American Jewish public figures who share a similar tough criticism to current Israeli politics, including Peter Beinart, Norman Finkelstein, and Max Blumenthal, and it raises the question whether there's a special sense of mission, a special feeling of political responsibility, a special Jewish factor playing a role. But of course, in other parts of Israel we find similar intellectual attacks on Israel, sometimes loud and provocative, and sometimes in a rather hidden or subtle way. Thus, in the aftermath of 9/11, the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk reversed George W. Bush's nomination of Mideastern rogue states and claimed that the United States of America and Israel would be the real rogue states. And shortly before his death in 2016, the popular Italian writer Dario Fo, a Nobel laureate in literature, claimed in an interview with La Repubblica that Moses killed women and children for having committed idolatry, and complained about the brutality of Jews against followers of other religions as we can experience it today. This statement by Dario Fo might be especially denigrating, but it reveals stereotypes against Jews and, of course, Israeli Jews, which we hoped had already been forgotten. Anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish manifestations increase especially when the Israeli-Palestinian conflict escalates. And then we also have human rights organizations and, not to forget, whole groups of networks or local churches which want to take a position in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and often take the Palestinian side as that of the supposedly weaker opponent. There are church congresses now which dedicate special attention to the Palestinian Nakba in 1948, without providing any background regarding the causes of the Israeli independence war of 1947-48. Church events focus especially on human rights violations by the Israeli military or police, but do not mention subtle or open efforts of Palestinians to develop effective terrorist structures, like the obsessive excavation of terrorist tunnels from Gaza to Israel. At least in Europe, there are indications that anti-Israeli attitudes could become a common denominator for some of the Christian congregations. For example, in the fall of 2013, the Methodist Church in Britain launched an online survey among its members to determine whether or not the church should support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Among the Christian theologians, in view of the unsolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict, some have obviously fallen back into anti-Israel cliches, which are easily discernible as anti-Jewish. Thus, the German Protestant theologian Jochen Vollmer wrote in the prestigious German Pastor's Journal, Deutsches Pfarrerblatt, already in 2011, quote, "We, the Christians of Germany, cannot theologically compensate our untold guilt toward Jews by considering the state structure of the people of Israel as a sign of God's loyalty. A state which has made hundreds of thousands of innocent people victims and continues to do so." In consequence, Vollmer denied the Jewish state a Christian theological recognition because of its alleged inhuman behavior. This is a typical example I would call ethical correctness, and means primarily taking care of the Palestinians as an ethno-cultural minority group that appears as the loser in an asymmetric conflict. For future research, it seems to be worthwhile exploring to what extent Christian churches, and especially their local communities, are indeed willing to join political forces with an anti-Israel line of attack, like the BDS. Moreover, to what extent they are also sensitized for recently expelled Christians from Middle East frontier states around Israel. Thank you for your attention.